One of the other areas that impacts on the sole purpose test is when there's an LRBA arrangement, the amortisation of the liability might exceed the time frame where the pension may commence. What are your thoughts on that and how it impacts the sole purpose test?
Again, we see a lot of SMSFs that have been established for the sole purpose of acquiring a property. Now, the use of terminology there is deliberate because it's there really as part of a property acquisition scheme or arrangement, and it's not necessarily in the best interests of the members. There's nothing wrong with an LRBA itself if it's handled properly and if all due consideration is given to all aspects of the LRBA. In my view, if you start off an LRBA, you have got to have a very clear exit mechanism in mind. And an exit mechanism could be, well, what happens if we hit retirement? Should we still be in the LRBA? Well, if anybody's had experience dealing with transfer balance reporting issues and an LRBA with a member in retirement phase, it's a nightmare, absolute nightmare. But apart from that, you've got people who are not necessarily earning income in the retirement phase. You've got ongoing debt obligations. You really have to have this exit strategy in mind. How are you going to handle that? In the accumulation phase, you've got a whole series of issues. Do we need to continue to maintain insurance benefits so that we've got some funding if something happens to a member who's been subject to the LRBA arrangement? Again, a whole series of issues. From a wider financial planning perspective, if we look at the arrangements around LRBAs, I've yet to see an LRBA that doesn't have personal guarantees required from the members in their personal capacities. So even though the loan is with a different entity, you really have to look at the lending, the total lending over the client's, if you like, holistic base to determine whether or not that level of debt is just going a bit overboard. In many cases, I see it purely because there's an additional entity into which someone can leverage, that the leverage is done without due consideration to the other issues. But the exit mechanism is particularly important. What happens if a member dies? What happens if a member is unable to contribute or is made permanently disabled, for example? What happens if in the event of a divorce?
Yes, I was just about to say that, Neil. What happens in the event of a divorce?
Well, that's probably the worst of all scenarios because that's not something you can fund.
And it's also, and it's also quite emotional, and sometimes the property may have been purchased with the mind of retiring in the property.
Yeah, that has happened in the past, and that's where Section 65 of the SIS Act comes in. Either that, or the property is then sold to the member from the fund at market value, and provided we meet Section 109 arm's length dealing rules, then we're fine. But we're potentially incurring another round of stamp duty. So again, does that make sense from a total holistic financial planning perspective?